For those of you who I may not have met before, my name's Debbie Reinhardt. I'm the CEO and founder of Resource Property Management. And I also happen to serve as the president for CEOMC, the organization which Mark and Josh work with. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them in just a moment. For housekeeping purposes, if everybody can just mute themselves. If you have a question, we'd ask that you type it in the chat. That's at the bottom of the page when you move your cursor around, and just type in whatever your question might be. You also may want to change your view screen to be the speaker. This way you can not have to see all these other faces, and you can see who is ever speaking at the time. Okay, so our goal today is to update you on the legislative process, where we were, where we are, and where we hope to go in 2024. We hope to explain and clarify the recent changes and offer guidance as to how best to move forward related to the updated legislative requirements, and to address, time permitting, any questions and concerns you may have. We are very fortunate today to have both Mark Anderson and Josh Burkett leading the discussion. As a way of introduction, Mark Anderson is the executive director and Josh Burkett, a lobbyist for CEOMC. CEOMC stands for Chief Executive Officers of Management Company. We are a statewide organization representing all of Florida, dealing with community associations, community association managers, and management companies of community associations. And we are the main lobbying effort when it comes to legislative issues concerning our communities. We want to take this opportunity to thank Mark and Josh for attending today. They both, for many years, have been very instrumental in working with our community associations and leading the efforts when it comes to the legislative changes that occur. So with that, I would like to, I'm not sure who's going to open it up, whether it's going to be Josh or Mark, but thank you both again. Your support has been extremely helpful and appreciated through all these years. So take it away.
Well, Debbie, I'll start. This is good afternoon. I'm Mark Anderson, and as Debbie mentioned, I'm the executive director of CEOMC, and I'm joined today with my associate Josh Burkett, who has worked hand in glove with me on everything we've been working on over the last couple of years, and really the last several years. But wanted to just take a moment to first thank Debbie for what she's done. She is our president of CEOMC. She was also very instrumental in participating with a workshop that the Florida Senate had scheduled for the Surfside legislation. And because of her testimony, a lot of what we're about to talk about today that was in the bill that passed and is awaiting approval from the governor made it into that bill. And that was also true last year. So Debbie, we thank you for your leadership. We also want to thank really all of our management companies. And I would just say at the outset of my comments today,
join the meeting,
that if you don't have a management company, that you please consider having a professional licensed management company. We've been on the front lines of this fight for you as a community in the state of Florida for many years. A lot of these things we're talking about today relate to Surfside, but many more don't. Over the last number of years, we led the effort to successfully ensure that your governing documents will not be overridden when it comes to short-term rental regulation. When it comes to a lot of things that affect you directly, we've been out there on the front lines, and our management companies have been working through CEOMC to advance your interests and to try to protect your interests in Tallahassee with our state legislature. Just at the outset, I would just, that's a great segue into kind of what we do. We are primarily an advocacy organization. And in the state of Florida, as you may know, for many of you, you may know, some of you may not already know, Florida is a term limited state. Our legislators are limited to 8 years. Some leave their seats well before then. And we have a term limited executive branch, including our governor. So we have the job of advocacy never stops. It is an ongoing process in Florida. And we have an obligation to really to engage our legislators. And we do so not only in Tallahassee, but we do so throughout the rest of the year. Every 2 years, CEOMC engages in candidate interviews in which we endorse candidates and we advance the interests of our communities and of our management companies before these candidates, before they're ever elected to the legislature. We started that in 2018, and we did so again this past year in 2022. Surfside was at the very top of that list. Among many things we were working on, Surfside was clearly a big part of the conversation we were having. As a result of that, we prevailed in nearly every one of our candidate endorsements in 2022, which yielded a great deal of success for us in 2023 relating to Senate Bill 154 and many other things that you may not see that we defeated that were very harmful to your ability to do your job. Debbie, I'll be happy to go into Senate Bill 154. I guess I'll just kind of focus my comments on Surfside. There's a lot I could say here, but really this started back in going back to 2021, after the collapse of the Champlain Towers at Surfside, Florida. We saw a tremendous amount of activity that was intended to be helpful, but some of it wasn't all that helpful. And there's always a tendency for government to overcorrect and to come in with solutions that it thinks are helpful, but in their application are not all that helpful. And we saw that kind of play out with the original Surfside legislation in 2022. Senate Bill 4D is what it's called, and it is now the law of the land. And we have been operating under Senate Bill 4D for the last year or so. That bill passed through the legislature in 2022 during a special session of the legislature with no amendments and no public testimony after it had failed to pass the legislature during the regular session in 2022. And much of the problem that we've experienced with Senate Bill 4D, and many of you have experienced since its passage, has come from the fact that much of that bill did not embrace the input of many of the stakeholders that were at the table, including CEOMC, CAI, and many others who were participating with that bill. Moving into the next summer, into that summer of last year and into the fall of last year, as we prepared for 2023, the legislature was hearing, thankfully, a significant amount of feedback from our communities that were telling them unequivocally, this is not workable. You cannot apply a one-size-fits-all approach to reserves or to how do we provide for reserves? What does it mean to fully fund your reserves? Just because Champlain Towers did not properly reserve its funds doesn't mean everybody else is doing the same thing. How can we ensure that that we are not harming the very people that Senate Bill 4D was intended to serve? And so the legislature moving into 2023 was hearing a lot of that feedback, particularly along the lines of the cost impact. Senate Bill 4D
joined the meeting.
Senate Bill 4D imposed a significant amount of cost increases, and I think it was fair to say, I don't believe that it was intended, but that was certainly the application. When you require people who for many years have never reserved their funds, and not only do they not reserve their funds, state law not permitted and instructed them how to waive their reserves, you have a problem on your hands with many communities who suddenly overnight are going from either not funding or not adequately funding their reserves to suddenly having to fully fund or be in the process of fully funding those reserves. And so the legislature was hearing that and was I think interested in doing that. But quite frankly, it was CEOMC and it was our advocacy that enabled a workshop to then be scheduled. Debbie, as I mentioned at the top of my comments, participated with a number of other stakeholders in providing input to the legislature about why Senate Bill 4D was a problem, some of the gaps that were perhaps unintentional, but were nevertheless very harmful to the ability of these associations to even comply with the law. Many of our communities just did not, it wasn't that they weren't willing to, they just did not know how to comply with a statute that really created a significant burden in terms of the structural integrity reserve study, the one-size-fits-all approach to what many of you have been doing very successfully for many years. If you've been reserving your funds, if you've been pooling your reserves, if you've been doing things that work for you and you are meeting those targets and you have a reserve study, Senate Bill 4D really disrupted a lot of that. And so we came into the 23 session with the hope that we would get a bill. Quite frankly, that did not happen as quickly as we would have liked. I think there was some in positions of leadership in the legislature who felt that maybe this was not necessary. And thankfully, through the advocacy of our advocacy and many others, the legislature, I think, and thanks to the Florida Senate, Senator Joe Gruters, the Senate President, and many others, the Senate really took the lead on filing the first bill, which became Senate Bill 154. The House then followed suit and filed a bill that was sponsored by Representative Vicki Lopez, who did a great job. Her counterpart in the Senate was Senator Jennifer Bradley. And moving forward, the two bills that were filed were initially very different. And over the next several weeks during the legislative session, those bills became more similar, but still remained significantly different in some areas that were important to resolve, namely in the issue of reserves, reserve funding, reserve studies, and what it is that we're supposed to reserve for, what do you not reserve for, and the pooling of reserves, and whether or not you can do some of these things that Senate Bill 4D either did not speak to or appeared to not allow you to do at all. So the bills fortunately were married up at the end of session, and I'm giving an extremely condensed version of this, Debbie, for the sake of time. I'm happy to go into more detail as we go into this, but over the legislative session, the Senate bill was really kind of ahead of the House bill. And I think because of what the Senate bill contained, it, I think, allowed the House to come to a more reasonable position. I think that was really our struggle going into the session was the Florida House and some of the staff members of the Florida House did not think that there was an overt problem. The Senate had a different point of view. Representative Lopez and the rank and file membership of the House, and I think the Speaker of the House had a different point of view, and they did feel that a bill needed to be filed. And in the end, Senate Bill 154 was the bill that passed. It addressed a number of critical things. I don't think it's fair. I think it's fair to say, and we'll get into some of this too, Debbie, that it did not go far enough. It did not address a lot of the things that we would have liked to have seen it address, but it did address some things that I think we absolutely had to have that the prior year, the legislature had said no to. And so the bill, as we see it now, Senate Bill 154 is sitting before the governor. It has not been approved yet. He has, I think, as of a couple of days ago, he's got up to 15 days to approve this bill, or it will become law without his signature, or he could veto the bill. I don't expect that he will veto the bill. I think he will approve this bill, and I think there is an intent moving forward that there will be additional legislation filed for next year to address some of these more critical cost drivers, namely around the issue of insurance, and also how do we ensure that we can more clearly say that a community, if you're pooling your reserves, you can continue to do that. I know we're going to get into some of those. I've seen a few questions relative to that. And we'll answer those questions in due time. But that's kind of a big picture summary of how we got here. And again, I could go on for a good bit of time here, Debbie, but suffice it to say, we had a very successful legislative session. We had a lot of significant leadership from our legislators. And I just want to thank our management companies. And I want to thank any of you on this call today that may have engaged your legislators and letting them know how you feel. That is so critical to the success of this issue and many other issues that we're dealing with on any given day. We're battling, we battled up to 3 dozen different bills that were harmful to the ability of an association to operate, for a board to operate, as well as some other legislation that we were dealing with that did pass, which we'll talk about if you're happy. If we're,
Join the meeting.
But
hey, Mark, can we just stop there for 1 second? Because I would like for you to just touch briefly on the fact that many of our communities were standing by, ready to send out those emails that I kept talking to them about, that, hey, get ready, we're going to need your input. And there's a time and a place that you very carefully guided us on, and due to the progress that we were making, there was really no need to flood the inboxes of our legislators. So can you just kind of quickly touch base on that? Because I don't want our boards to think that they didn't have an opportunity to do that, but we were
Yes.
at your direction kind of holding off.
Yeah, that's a great question, Debbie. And that's always something we hold in reserve to make sure that we've certainly done that with great success in prior years where we've asked our communities to write our legislators, to email our legislators. And we were ready to do that this year. We saw, but we really started to see a breakthrough with at the committee level and really with the bill sponsors. We saw some significant progress in the bill that would have, I think, it became unnecessary to unleash a lot of those emails on our legislators. I think they got the message. I think they were also hearing from their own communities, and many of them were particularly from South Florida, where you have condo-heavy districts. Many of these legislators came back after having been around for a year and listening to their constituents, came to Tallahassee already aware of what was going on. So really emails, and we certainly want to do that when it's necessary, when it's targeted. Sometimes it can often have the opposite effect of what they're intended to have. It could kind of go the other way. But what we saw, folks, is that we saw a legislature become much more receptive and responsive to the things we were asking. The bill that we ended up finally getting over the goal line this year contained nearly all of what we asked for. I mean, the things that we didn't ask for were things that were quite honestly just not going to be agreed to between the House and Senate. But the things that we could gain agreement on, they gave us just about everything we asked for. And so for that, we really just kind of held back. And I know there was another bill that we can talk about later, but there was another bill out there we were hearing from some of our companies. Should we start emailing our legislature on that bill, which was significantly problematic at the time it was filed? And I said no to that one as well, because we were having some conversations and negotiations with the bill sponsor, with the committees, and that were very they were showing some significant progress. And I think it was fair to say we ended up getting in that bill a lot of what we asked for as well. So there's a time and a place for those emails, and they're very important. And we encourage you to continue doing that. During session, though, sometimes it really doesn't, it's not always the most effective thing, depending on the time and circumstance.
Okay, so I think for time's sake and to get us kind of moving into the meat of what we're here today to really talk about is the milestone, the structural integrity reserves, how we're able to proceed, what our recommendations are for communities to maybe moving forward, how there are still some questions related to pooling, and where we feel the spirit of the law is, and kind of helping our boards kind of navigate all of that.
Well, I'm gonna let Josh speak to some of the more
Sure.
specifics, but let me just touch on a few things that I think are important for you moving forward. Is that on your structural integrity reserve studies, one of the concerns we had going into the session was there was a lot of confusion over who could do these things, and many of you have employed and continue to employ and engage reserve study specialists that do this work. Prior to this bill, Senate Bill 154 passing the legislature, and again, it's not yet law. We're still operating as we speak right now under Senate Bill 4D, but Senate Bill 154, should the governor approve that bill, will clearly allow you to continue using your reserve specialists. Senate Bill 4D did not really clearly say that, it didn't say you could use a reserve specialist. It created a lot of confusion. So we clarified that. And on the SIRS, I would encourage you to get a reserve study more than every 10 years. I know there was an issue a question relating to inflation and getting these SIRS done every 10 years as the law lays out. It says up to 10 years. You should really get a reserve study done much more frequently than that to ensure that those are staying consistent with the cost of the depreciation of your buildings and the cost of all those things that are going up exponentially almost each and every year. I would, the standard I think is 3 to 5 years. If you wait for 10 years, that's something that I think is going to be a little more problematic for you. And on the pooling of reserves, I know we've heard a lot of that. There's confusion over whether or not Senate Bill 4D allows you to pool your reserves. And those are great questions. I think it's a fair question because Senate Bill 4D did not speak to that. And when you read it on its face, it seems to suggest a straight line method of reserve funding, not pooling. And over the interim months, I want to say this is another reason I think I'm grateful to CEOMC for its leadership and for a number of things that we've been working on. During the interim and on the DBPR website, on the frequently asked questions page of its website, it clearly says pooling is allowed under Senate Bill 4D. It's one of the most frequent questions they've gotten. It's one of the most frequent questions, if not the most frequent questions I get. And the agency that regulates statutorily condos has said publicly on its website, you can in fact do pooling of reserves. The Senate Bill 154 that passed the legislature that's waiting approval by the governor did not get into pooling. There was a desire on the part of the bill sponsors to not weigh into that and to allow the agency to be kind of the governing authority on that. We may well want to address that in next year's bill. There just was not an appetite to get into some of that because of some questionable things that were going on in South Florida that quite frankly, I think we could still clarify and not enable some of those bad actors to continue doing what they were doing. But that said, I think there is sufficient clarity on the DBPR website to do that, to allow you to continue if you're pooling your reserves. Clearly, the bill sponsors last session and this session have said, yes, the intent is to allow you to continue pooling your reserves if that's how you're doing it. And I think that's something that we wanted to make sure that we clarify. Let me get Josh in here because I know Josh worked with me very closely on this bill and I know has been fielding a lot of questions as well. And Josh has worked very closely with me. And Josh, if you would just go ahead and address some of the things I know that we talked about offline prior to this phone call today relative to Surfside.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Debbie. Hello, everybody. As Mark said, my name is Josh Burkett, and I've worked with Mark for the last several years on many different pieces of legislation, including Senate Bill 4D during the 22 special session and with Senate Bill 154. So I wanted just to touch on a couple things of the differences between what we are currently operating under Senate Bill 4D and the new law, Senate Bill 154, if it were to be approved by the governor. And I agree with Mark that I do not see the governor vetoing this bill. He has until June 20th to act on it. So here in the next 2 weeks or so, this should be the law of the land. One of the things that both bills dealt with is your milestone inspection requirements. The milestone inspection in the original Senate Bill 4D had two components to it. So it was 30 years or then 25 years if you were within 3 miles of the coastline. Now, one of the issues that arose in the interim between the last two sessions was, what is the definition of a coastline? What they were coming to find out is if you had, for instance, I know a lot of you are in the Tampa Bay area, if you had a condominium association that was on Bayshore Boulevard in Hillsborough County, you were more than 3 miles from the coastline. So you technically weren't considered next to saltwater, which doesn't really make a lot of sense since you would be right on Tampa Bay. So one of the things that the bill did is made it a little more clear to where milestone inspections need to be completed when the building reaches 30 years of age and every 10 years after. That's across the board for the state. Now, for certain communities, they allowed the local jurisdiction, so that would be your local county, to implement stricter inspection requirements if they wish. So for instance, if Pinellas County wanted to say, well, we think it's better for you guys to inspect once every 20 years, then that is when you would need to do your inspection. So unless your county has a different time frame for you, it is when your building reaches 30 years of age and every 10 years after. One of the other things that popped up was this idea of mixed use condominiums. This is something more that's prevalent in South Florida, but I know that especially in downtown St. Pete, these are starting to pop up. And what I mean by mixed use is you might have a condominium association that is part condo association, has residential units, and then it's part hotel, and there's retail shops along the bottom. And the way that the original Senate Bill 4D laid out was the responsibility to pay for the milestone inspection was borne solely by the residential association, which is ridiculous because the documents for that individual building would have already laid out how they would divvy up the costs for any work to be done. So one of the things that Senate Bill 154 did was recognize the documents of the association. So that way that however those documents are laid out, the owners of the association wouldn't be required to pay for parts of the milestone that impacted the hotel or the retail shops there. And along those same lines too, they also recognize the documents when it comes to, I know we had some questions about windows. So what Senate Bill 154 did is cleared up confusion to where if there are elements of the property that are not the responsibility of the association, i.e. they are the responsibility of whether it's a retail shop, a hotel, or the individual unit owners themselves, the association does not need to fund or maintain those items. We wanted to recognize your individual documents there when it came to the milestone inspection. I'm going to pause there for just 1 second, Debbie, to see if anyone has questions about milestones, because there are other parts of this bill I'm going to get into quickly dealing with insurance and the structural integrity reserve study aspect of this, but I wanted to just see if there is a milestone question. Yeah. No.
Yes, Josh, I had a question about, are there any buildings that are excluded from the requirement? For example, if a community has other structures like clubhouses or parking garages or whatever the case may be, are those excluded? Is it limited only to residential buildings?
Yes, so they limited it to the residential buildings and buildings over 3 stories in height. Because remember, the whole idea of this bill is to keep residents safe. So for instance, you know, if you have a parking garage, you should probably still get everything looked at by an engineer to make sure everything is structurally sound. But when we're talking about the requirements of Senate Bill 154, we actually went a little further to the exclusions. So single family, 2 family, or 3 family dwellings with 3 or fewer habitable stories above ground. Now, what they're getting at there is, let's say you have a 2-story townhome condo, and there's a garage on the 3rd floor, you know, like a breakaway structure, especially some of those on the coast. So there are 2 livable stories and then a garage. You would be excluded from like the SERS requirement because you need to really have 3 or more habitable stories.
Okay.
Josh, real quick to that. What about 2-story villas that are attached to towers by catwalks? And then what defines 3 stories?
So I think he just answered the 3 stories.
Yeah,
Habitable.
okay. So what about a
stories.
2-story villa that's attached to towers by a catwalk?
They should talk to their attorney.
Yes.
Because it's going to depend on all kinds of things about the catwalk and what they considered it attached to. Again, if we're looking at this from like a 30,000-foot view, they want to keep people safe. So if the tower were to come down, would it also jeopardize the people in the 2-story villa? I mean, you know, that the idea of this whole bill is about safety. I know that, you know, this is about cost, but from the legislature's standpoint, it's really about keeping people safe. So, you know, for something like the 2-story villa with it attached by towers to catwalks, I have no idea. You know, you'd have to talk with your attorney, talk with your local building department, because the enforcement agency of all of this is the local building departments. But when it comes to like the milestone inspection, So, that reach out to your county, have them come out, they'll take a look at it and let you know if those are the requirements. More than likely, they'll err on the side of caution and say that it is, but that is something to bring out.
Okay, so there's going to be a lot of specifics that we can't kind of address all of them. I think the next question about 4-story, I think Josh answered that. If there's 3 livable spaces in a garage on the ground floor, that falls under the milestone inspection and the SERS. Josh, do touch base, because a lot of our communities were getting some mixed signals when it came to holding off on moving forward with either the milestone inspection or the structural integrity reserve study because of what was happening in Tallahassee. And I think our guidance today is to say, you need to move forward with your milestone inspection and your structural integrity reserve study sooner than later, because those things are not going to go away with any changes in the legislative next year. We're just going to continue to hopefully tweak the requirements, but the requirements are still going to be what they need to do.
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely, Debbie. I mean,
Okay.
that is the message for the next year before the next legislative session is your communities need to go out, they need to get a milestone, they need to get a SERS, and also because we need to start collecting data on these studies, because there is, how much do they actually cost? Everyone had ideas, but until we start seeing what the cost of the milestone is, what the cost of the SERS, and more importantly, what the cost of the repairs and the reserve requirements are going to be. So a couple things too that we tried to do in this legislative session is Senate Bill 4D from the special session that we were trying to fix this year, laid out a bunch of new things for your associations to do as it relates to engineering reports and reserve studies. And so we really tried to give a better roadmap to associations to say how you can do this. And so with that information now, it is important that these associations around the state start implementing this law. I do not foresee any way that the SERS will go away or these milestone inspections. These are here to stay, making minor tweaks to how they're applied to some of the questions like catwalks attached to stories. I mean, those are things that will be addressed later on, but the big picture is get a structural integrity reserve study and get your milestone inspections and start reserving your funds well before the deadline. There's going to be a bottleneck. We don't know how, the engineers themselves don't know how many engineers there are out there to do these milestone inspections. And one of the things that we were concerned about was that an association would get in trouble for not having a milestone inspection done by the deadline. So one of the things that we included in Senate Bill 154 is to avoid some of this bottleneck is that you would just need to be under contract with an engineering firm before the deadline.
Which is, we tell them the deadline, 12/31/24.
Yes,
Right.
Yep, 12/31/24 for the SERS and the milestone for both of them.
Right.
So
Right.
we have 18 months.
Okay, and Josh, to that point, and I see a question here, and I've come across this on numerous meetings with boards. Both of these items are required. A milestone inspection is not a structural integrity reserve study. They're
Right.
two totally different reports which need to be done.
Correct.
Mhm.
Now, one thing that they do include in Senate Bill 154 is if you have had an engineering inspection that covers parts of the structural integrity reserve study, they can be combined. But see, it's interesting because where the confusion was coming in is that a structural integrity reserve study is a funding tool for your associations. It allows you to know how to fund for the components listed in the SERS, which is in paragraph G of the bill. A milestone inspection is an engineering report, something completely different that doesn't have to do with funding. So if you get a milestone, it's not going to tell you how many years you have left on your roof, what the cost is to replace it, and how much money your association needs to be putting away each year to pay for the roof or reserves in general if you're using the pool method. So those are two different things. Now, there are aspects to both reports that do overlap. And what the legislature tried to do in Senate Bill 154 is not have associations duplicate all the work if necessary. So bringing me to my next point, which is talk to your providers. If you use an engineering firm, I see there's a question in here. If you did a milestone in 2022, do we have to do a SERS? Well, yes, you need to have both, but there will be aspects of your milestone that can already be incorporated into parts of your SERS. So you need to talk with your milestone provider and talk with your SERS provider, your reserve study specialist, or whoever you have doing this, and have them work together. As boards, as property managers, everyone has a fiduciary duty to the owners, and there are ways to do this in a more cost-effective manner. So if you are able to talk with your SERS provider and say, all right, well, we have this milestone and it covers 4 of the 9 items in the SERS, use this information, that's less you have to inspect, and work out a different price with them. Also get multiple bids on some of these things.
And also, Josh, to that point, keep in mind that not all of the professionals are interpreting the statute the way we are explaining it today. Case in point is the pooling of the structural integrity reserve items. And so you need to question them as to where they are with that, because if you get a report by a reserve specialist or by an engineer for the structural integrity component of what needs to be done, and they've completed it as a component scheduler and saying to you, that's how you have to fund it. Well, that's the report you got to live with unless you get a different one. So you have to be clear. And I'm sorry, just to make someone pointed out, the milestone inspection deadline is 12/31/24 if your building is 30 years or older. Obviously, if you have a younger building, it's when you mature at 30 years. Yeah.
Yes. Yep. So when your building reaches 30 years of age, you need to have a milestone. If your building was built in 1970, you technically needed a milestone in the year 2000. But since this law wasn't in effect, you have until 12/31/24 to get your milestone inspection. Now, one thing too, as far as these deadlines are concerned, with the funding, I know Mark mentioned this. So one of the questions that everyone has been asking is, do we need all of the money now or just a portion of it? And the answer is, it depends on what your structural integrity reserve study says. And what I mean by that is the purpose of the law is you need to be following a reserve schedule. So if your community gets a SERS and says that your roof has 7 years left, and for sake of round numbers, it cost $50,000, then in year 1, you are putting away 50 divided by 7, give plus or minus inflation. But on that same token, if you get a structural integrity reserve study that says you should have replaced your roof 3 years ago and you're way past due because there's problems with it, you will need all the money for the roof immediately. So it is again going to depend on what your milestone inspection and your structural integrity reserve study says, which is to Debbie's point about why you as managers and as board members need to speak to your professionals who are performing these services. Get an understanding of what their view is on the law, get an understanding of how they're going to treat the funding requirements, and you may have to get second opinions. Mark and I dealt with an issue in Pensacola that a legislature brought up who is even misinterpreting Senate Bill 4D. And this association got an engineering firm to come out and do their structural integrity reserve study. And that engineer recommended full replacement cost immediately of every single component. So instead of doing like deferred maintenance over 30 years on all the plumbing in the building, they said, well, you need to replace every single pipe all at once next year. I mean, that it was going to be like a $90,000 special assessment per unit, which is misinterpreting the statute and isn't correct. And that isn't how anyone would operate. And so that association unfortunately had to go out and get a second opinion, but in the long run, it saved their owners money from a special assessment that nobody can afford.
They
So
wouldn't
like,
they wouldn't have gotten a second opinion had they not spoken to their legislator, who then called us and said, what do we do? The important thing that can be resolved, that can resolve all of this, and I do see this becoming more of an issue, because you have in Senate Bill 4D and Senate Bill 154 really did not go. I mean, it clarified that reserve study specialists can continue to do the visual inspection portion of the reserve study. That's very helpful, but the law will remain the same in terms of allowing other types of people to do these reserve studies. So my recommendation would be, in order to avoid the confusion we saw up in the Panhandle, which I'm absolutely convinced will play out other places, if it is to simply continue to engage your reserve study specialists as you have, because some of these guys don't know. There's going to be folks out there that are going to try to game the system, that are going to try to, they have dollar signs in their eyes. They're going to try to say, go out there and market themselves as a reserve study. They don't know what they're doing. And so the intent was to diversify the number of people providing this service so that you can, in fact, so there were enough people able to meet these deadlines. The fact is, my recommendation is, given some of the examples we've been dealing with, is to continue working with your reserve study specialists who are credentialed as laid out in Senate Bill 154. And that will avoid a lot of this confusion, because that building would not, they would have had to assess their owners $90,000 per unit, and were prepared to do that on a brand new building that did not require that. And that reserve study was incorrect. So I think that that's where you probably ought to not only have a second opinion, but just really go into, if you've got a good reserve study company that you've been working with, they should know how to do this stuff. My recommendation would be to stick with those guys who've been doing this work.
and one of the things too is with Senate Bill 154, we also try to make it clear that if you guys have existing engineering studies, that is something too that you can talk, like for example, let's say that your building was built in 1990 and you have not had a milestone inspection. You should have had one in 2020, and now you are required by this new law to have your milestone done by 12/31/24. However, let's say that last year you had a $4 million concrete restoration project done on your building. You obviously had an engineer come out and look at the building and who recommended that you do a concrete restoration. And so again, there are going to be aspects of your recent restoration project, roofing project, or anything else that had a licensed PE come out to your property within the last 5 years that you could look at. And either, if your local enforcement agency says that, oh, this report covers all the aspects of the milestone, well, then you've already had one done, and your next date would be 10 years from the date of that inspection. So again, you're going to need to talk with your local enforcement agencies, talk with your attorneys. But what I wanted to bring up, though, is just this idea that we have tried to make this as cost effective as possible for the associations until we can get into forthcoming sessions. So the intent of the legislature is not to have you all duplicate work. This is about reining in the bad actor associations whose building is in severe disrepair, who's never funded any of their reserves, and getting those people caught up. So I know that many of you on this call, that doesn't apply to you. You guys have been funding reserves at some level. You have people come out and look at your buildings, and the intent of the law isn't to disrupt safe buildings. It's to rein in the bad actors. And that's the lens that we should be viewing this from.
Josh, another big question, and I think we did address this in the bill this year, was that there's associations that have different size buildings throughout their community. So some may be 2 stories, some may be 3 stories. So can you kind of cover that if they have varying stories within their one association, how they need to proceed? I'm of the understanding that they have to get the milestone and the SIRS on all of them, but you can.
So a reserve study is done on an association-wide basis and is a good idea to have those done. Now, the way the bill lays everything out, the requirements for like the milestone. So you have an engineering report and a structural integrity reserve study, 2 different things, and it's based on the height of the building, but it is unclear. And so the erring on the side of caution is that if you have a structure over 3 habitable stories, then you need to get these reports done. And also,
For the entire community, for all of the buildings, whether they're 3 stories or not.
in my opinion, Debbie, when it comes to the structural integrity reserve study, because you're getting a reserve study for funding for the association, they should come out and look at all the components of your association for funding. For an individual milestone inspection by an engineer, if you wanted to limit it to just the 3-story buildings,
It's okay,
it's
but
okay,
I live in a 2-story.
Also the purpose of the bill is safety, right?
Right.
So, just because the legislature picked an arbitrary number of stories, which is what they did, it is an arbitrary number of stories, does not mean that if an engineer is going to come out and look at one of your buildings, they should look at the rest of your buildings while they are out there, just to make sure that there are no issues. Because again, this is about safety for the residents of the association. And again, that is the lens we need to be looking at.
Great advice. And so for those communities that this addresses, 1, talk to your attorney, because again, it's not clear. But 2, if I live there and I live in a 2-story building and my money's going to pay for the 3-story building inspection, I'm probably not going to be happy that you're not inspecting my building also. So, okay.
Yeah, true.
Okay. We have, what are the 9 things being checked? Is that in the milestone? I guess that's a question related to the milestone.
That's the structural integrity.
Oh, structural integrity. Okay.
Well, it's technically 10, but well, I mean, no, they're correct on the number. They just have a catch-all. So the structural integrity reserve study includes roof, structural components, which basically is a big definition that picks up load-bearing walls, primary structure systems, so on and so forth. And that is something that your SIRS provider will be able to tell you what your primary structural systems are. They use the Florida Building Code to define that. So, you can take a look at the Florida Building Code for the primary structural members. Fireproofing and fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical systems, waterproofing, exterior painting, windows and exterior doors. Now, again, windows and exterior doors would only apply to what the association is responsible to maintain. So, if in your documents, if the windows are the responsibility of the unit owner, your reserve study provider would come out. He would look at the windows because the legislature wants everything looked at. And if there's not a problem with any of the windows, it doesn't need to be included in the reserve schedule because it's not the responsibility of the association. And then the catch-all I mentioned is any other item that has a deferred maintenance expense or replacement cost that exceeds $10,000 and affects the other items in G. And basically what they're getting at is one of the things that isn't listed there is like the elevators. The elevators have a deferred maintenance expense of over $10,000. And if you have elevators in your building and you don't maintain them, that would be an issue for your building. So it may be recommended in your SERS that we reserve for elevators, cooling towers, AC units. I mean, this is about safety. I don't know, anyone who wants to live in a building in Florida in the middle of the summertime that doesn't have a working AC. That could also be a safety issue for the residents. But those are the main items with a catch-all.
Okay. And so I'm just letting people know they're asking us to repeat the items again, that we'll be sending out the bill which lists those items in it so they
Yes,
can
and
refer to them.
again, just so everyone knows, so your roof, primary structural items, fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical, waterproof and painting, windows, and then anything else over $10,000, which is current law. As we did reserves now, even before Champlain Towers fell down, it was painting, paving, roofing, and anything over $10,000. So that's not changing.
Okay. I think we've tried to address the questions that we had online. What are we up to now? Sir, anything else you want to?
Well, one thing I did want to mention, I don't know how many people are on this call in buildings that this does not apply to. So anything, 3 non-habitable stories, 2 or down, they did make a change in this bill as it relates to waiving of reserves. So for those associations that are not under the SERS requirements. So if you are a 2-story townhome condominium, Senate Bill 154, Senate Bill 4D, and all of these requirements do not apply to you. However, they did make a change in the way that you would waive your reserves. So under the current law, a majority of a quorum of the owners at a meeting could vote to waive the reserves. So for example, if you have a 100-unit condominium and your documents say that 20% is a quorum, then you would need 11 members to waive your reserves at a meeting. If Senate Bill 154 is passed, you would need a majority of the total voting interest. So you now need 51 in a 100-unit to waive reserves or use reserves for any other purpose. This was intentional. The legislature thinks that reserving your funds is a good idea, and they wanted to make it more difficult for every association, not just those with high-rise buildings, to make it harder for them to waive their reserves. So that is one change that's going to apply to those associations that this bill doesn't affect. For those that this bill does affect, you cannot vote to waive reserves anymore, and you cannot vote to use reserves listed in the SERS for any other purpose other than replacement costs and deferred maintenance of those items.
However, for if an association chooses to fund those non-SERS components, they still can maybe partially fund those or
Yes.
vote to waive them or whatever, based on that new law, 51% of the entire membership.
Correct. Yes. Yes. For the non-structure, again, the purpose and goal of this legislation from the state, from the legislature, is about keeping people safe. So they focused it really only on what they viewed as structural components of the building. So for instance, if you guys your associations are putting money away to get new pool furniture out on the deck, however you were operating that before, you can continue to operate, whether you want to reserve for that, not reserve for that, fully fund it, partially fund it, move the money around. But when it comes to the structural items, that's where they put the guardrails on.
Okay, and from the conversation we're having today, it's clear that there are areas of this bill that we do need clarification on.
Yes.
And part of the request about gathering information, we did send out, Josh and Mark, we did send out a survey for our managers. And as they get this information, we're asking them to get it back to us. We also included insurance. So what we thought we would do is we would kind of say, okay, what are our premiums from 21, 22, 23, and maybe anticipation of 24 or something like that. So we want to get that information available, because whatever happens with these milestone inspections and the cost related to it, and the structural integrity reserve studies and the cost related with that, insurance is right behind it. And so, we're hoping that maybe if we can gather some of that information in addition to what you guys asked us for, that may arm us better moving into 2024.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that Mark and I started out this last session before it even began talking with members of the legislature about really the overarching problem is the cost. At the end of the day, we can streamline a lot of this stuff and make it more understandable, more readable, better for associations to comply with the law. But at the end of the day, the money has to come from somewhere. And I think that is what the legislature is failing to see. And so we have been asked by a number of stakeholders and legislators to gather information on how much all these new inspections are costing, and what special assessments, what repairs are these leading to. And then, as well as we all know, the big elephant in the room is the Florida insurance market. I mean, we had a couple of questions we looked at offline asking about rates going up if we don't have hurricanes or anything like that. But, in reality, the insurance market is a global market. And it's the cost of reinsurance, which is insane if you think about it. Insurance companies need to get insurance for their insurance, but that's literally what's happening in the marketplace. And the legislature is going to need hard data and numbers. And communities like all of yours are going to be extremely beneficial into showcasing the legislature that we were serious and we were correct when we said that there is going to be a funding problem. Whether you want to keep people safe or not, it is a valiant effort, and everyone, of course, wants our buildings to be safe, but we can't force people out of their homes at the same time. There needs to be a balancing act, and this data will help us hopefully achieve that goal.
So Mark, anything? I think we pretty much covered the basis for the discussion today.
I think the simple answer to a lot of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat room, and then just as I know many of you will have questions again offline, if you were to leave this call with one thing, I would say that you should definitely consider, in light of the significantly increased amount of regulation, the increased amount of activity that you as an association are going to be engaging in, that you must have a licensed professional management company working with you to help you navigate these hurdles that lie ahead over these next 18 months. I mean, and I don't know how many of you have a management company, but especially one who belongs to CEOMC, I think you've got to have someone who's plugged in to what's going on to help you navigate these waters that lie ahead of us, because it's just going to be critical that we get this data from you. It's going to be critical that you get these things done by December 31st of next year, the SIRS and the milestone. Those are the two things we know you have to have. They're non-negotiable. They're not going to change. And within those guardrails, we think there will be some adjustments made to make sure that we can, in fact, comply with the statute. But until then, I think it's important that you work with licensed professionals like Debbie, like our management companies who are out there keeping you informed of what's going on. And those of us out here in the advocacy space can channel that in the direction of informing our lawmakers so that they can make informed decisions on your behalf as well. So That would be really my comments if I had any to make in conclusion to all of this, Debbie.
Thank you, Mark. Hopefully, most of these people are with resource and they have a professional management company. We did have two more
Join the meeting.
comments. So,
Yeah.
so again, there's still a question regarding the floors, Josh, and habitable and parking. So if you could run through that again.
So the exact definition in the bill of what the SERS does, the requirement for the structural integrity reserve study does not apply to. 1, single family, doesn't apply. 2 family, or 3 family dwellings. So single, 2, or 3 family dwellings with 3 or fewer habitable stories above ground. So the question is going to be on habitable. I know that, so which is what you're gonna have to talk with your attorneys about, but I will tell you that the legislative intent, what they were trying to avoid is if you had a 3-story townhome, but the bottom floor, no one lived there. It's just a garage. No one's living in the garage. It's just the garage. And then you have 2 habitable floors on top of it. It would not apply. That was the legislative intent. And that's what they, again, when it's funny when you are up there and you're like writing definitions, you're like, oh yeah, all right, yeah, 3 or fewer habitable stories above ground, easy enough. And then you get out here into the real world and you have different attorneys with differing opinions of certain matters. Well, what is habitable? Like, oh, I guess I kind of have like a bathroom down there. I am down there sometimes. So the idea is, again, habitable stories. If it's not an actual living space that people are in, then this requirement should not apply. I saw another question about handrails in the association. So again, to reiterate, what we did in 154 is made it clear that any portion or component of the building that is not part of the condominium ownership. So whether it's exterior doors, balconies, rails, windows, your documents, so which is why you again need to talk with your attorney and your engineer and reserve study provider. Your individual documents will list out who is responsible for what elements of the association. So if something is the responsibility of the unit owner, it therefore does not need to be funded in the reserve study.
Okay, so there's another question that says that our existing reserves include many of the 9 items in the SERS. So what is different post Surfside versus pre-Surfside was those reserves, regardless of what they were, you were permitted to have a membership vote to waive, partially fund, borrow from, do all of those things. If they are a component that is specified in the SERS, the items defined in the SERS definition, you can no longer waive those. You can no longer borrow from them. You can no longer partially fund. Based on the report you get from your expert, your reserve study expert that you contract with, whatever your funding requirement is based on their report, you are bound to comply with.
Yes, and specifically to the question about the 9 items, I would recommend that they talk with whoever did their reserve study and have them come out and just do an update, if you will. Talk with them about what it would cost and what it would entail. Again, we're going to need to be proactive board members and property managers and treat this as if you were living in your single family home. If I wanted to get tree work done at my house, I would call several different tree companies and they would come out and all give me quotes and talk about scope of work. And I would pick the best one for the best price for what I'm trying to accomplish. And we need to treat this in the same manner. So if you have existing reserve studies, call them out and do an update. Maybe there's just like one item that isn't on here and it won't be as expensive. And then you also need to make sure that you're updating these reserve studies, because it is all going to depend on, as you said, Debbie, what the recommendations are on the funding. And even if you have reserves for these items, do you have enough reserves for these items? Because you can no longer partially fund. So no matter what, it would be a good idea to have someone come out and at least take a look. And if you already have a lot of this done on your own, then you should talk with them about negotiating the price that they're going to charge you to provide you the information.
Okay. Next question is there a conversation about extending the deadline for full funding requirement? And yes, those words were shared this past session. It's one of the items that Mark mentioned that we just could not foresee that we were going to make any headway with either side on the bill. So that is going to be something that we will be hopefully addressing in 2024 if there's an appetite to do that.
And we need the data.
And we need the data.
The
Absolutely.
data would help show that there is that the reason we're not, what the legislature doesn't want is associations are lazy and not getting these reports done, and so they just want more time. No, we need to show the data and the costs to say that associations are trying to comply with the law, but it's too expensive or there's not enough professionals. So we have got to show real reason and that we are trying everything we can to comply with the law, which is why the data is so important.
Well, let me just
Okay.
add to that too, on that, it's a highly controversial question. And the only answer, the only way you get to a yes with that is that our communities have got to, and this is something later on for 2024, because we'll be in an election year next year, a big one, is to make this, is to let your legislators know. And I would encourage you, and this is something that we should probably think of doing for other things, but to invite them into your board meetings. We need to collect this data first and foremost, but to have them come to your board meetings, have them come to and say, look, we can't comply with this thing by next year. It's the only way that you're going to change the political weather on this, because right now there is no appetite to moving this deadline unless there is going to be a significant groundswell of support from our communities to our legislators saying we can't do it. And the information we're collecting from you right now will help inform that. But I will say that it takes another layer of communication with our communities. Quite honestly, I just don't see that changing. We had tried to do that in 2022 and again in 23. It was not just no, it was hell no. So just to give you an idea of what the appetite in Tallahassee is toward that.
Okay, next question is about, is it prudent for our association board to plan to be fully funded based on milestone inspection and structural integrity reserve study? So just so we're clear, milestone inspection, if you pass and you're good to go, there's really nothing the board really needs to address except have it scheduled on the every, I guess, 10-year mark. However, if you go to the second phase where there's specific things that need to be remedied, that needs to be done within a time frame of the report. Separate and apart from what structural integrity reserve study is saying you need to put away for future items. So do you know the deadline or the time frame by once you get that second phase done and things need to be repaired or taken care of, what that time frame is?
I
It's
believe
180 days.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's 180 days. So Paul, who asked that question, kind of two different things we're talking about. You know, if you pass your milestone, you're good. If you have to go and get further testing and then you have repairs that need to be done based on that inspection, that has to be done, taken care of, separate and apart from what you're doing with the structural integrity reserve study. Okay, there's another one. There's been a lot of talk about allowing associations to count a line of credit as available reserves. Okay, so was that included, or will we need to assess to get reserves proper level by the deadline? Alternative source of funding, Josh.
So there are alternative funding sources are permissible in a bill for multifamily condos. Now, for individual lines of credit, the legislation is really silent on this. This is something that we, are looking at doing next year. And what I mean by it's silent is, again, if you want to use a line of credit, talk to your attorney or talk to several different attorneys until one of them will give you an opinion that says you can do a line of credit for your reserves. The law isn't always going to lay out everything that you need to do and how to do it, and it's rarely, if ever, black and white. From the standpoint of being a good board member and a good property manager is, have my buildings been inspected by an engineer? Have I got a reserve study? And am I funding the reserves at the level laid out in the reserve study? If I am doing those three things, then I am doing my fiduciary duty to the owners. And that is really how we need to look at this. So, your banking partners, if there's ways for you to get loans to help pay for this, lines of credit, the bill doesn't prohibit lines of credit, but it also doesn't say they're allowed. So, there are avenues and ways. At the end of the day, the legislature wants, if there's an issue with your building and it needs to be fixed to make it safe, well, then the legislature shouldn't prevent people from finding creative ways to pay for that.
And again, to confirm that the structural integrity reserve study needs to be completed no later than 12/31/24. So for the budget year of 1/1/25, we are fully funding the structural integrity reserve portion based on whatever report we have.
Correct. Correct. So any budget adopted on or after January 1st, 2025 has got to incorporate the SERS into it. So have it done well before the 12/31/24
deadline. Yep.
Doing your budgets for the 25 year and make sure that it's incorporated in there.
Can you explain further the definition of fully funding the reserve?
Yes. Really, it is going to depend on what your reserve study says. So, and I say reserve study because when you start saying structural integrity and SERS, people confuse it with the milestone engineering report. But when you get your reserve study, your SERS, it is going to lay out the funding schedule for your association, and you must follow it. So in year one, they're going to recommend you put away X. And in year one, you need to put away X. Whatever that amount is going to depend on the individual SERS, individual funding schedule.
Okay. And then to confirm another question, you may not borrow from the structural integrity reserve any longer. Even with a membership vote, no matter what you need the money for, that cannot be used for anything other than the components listed within the structural integrity reserve study.
Correct.
Okay, because that was another question. And
Yeah.
to Nancy Riley, I'm not sure what your question is. Does the association management give the reports? You mean, do we do structural integrity reserve studies or milestone inspections? The answer is no. If that's not what you're asking, just send us another question. Okay, I think, is that it? Oh,
My question was the
Oh.
reports that they're looking for. Do you compile those reports and give them to whomever? I'm confused on who the reports go to.
Right, that's my question.
so again, the question is, we will help you select a reserve study specialist and an engineer for your milestone inspection. The board will make a decision on who they want to use. Those reports are then given to the board for their information. There are certain things we have to do with the milestone inspection where we have to make them available, which we'll upload, but there isn't much more we do with the report than that. Hopefully I answered your question. If not,
So-
Nancy,
So Josh and Mark are looking for a compilation of the reports.
oh,
Oh.
our managers, I'm sorry. Our managers have already been issued a request of a document that they can autofill, asking them per association certain questions. So as your association moves forward with milestone inspections and reserve studies and insurance costs, they're gonna get that information, send it back to our corporate office. Then we're gonna compile it all and send it on to Josh and Mark.
Thank
Gotcha.
you.
Okay. So so we are thinking about putting this up on our website. People are asking, are they going to be able to go back and view this? So we should be able to put this up on our website. The next question is, sirs, are they now line items funding? Can they be pulled? Yes. So
I
again,
just put a link to the DBPR's website in the chat, Debbie.
great.
And they click on it and they have questions. So Senate Bill 4 under Senate Bill 4D. So even from last year, pooling was allowed. It's on their website and nothing in 154 changes that. In fact, I think it makes it more clear that pooling is allowed.
Right. Right. And that's how we're moving forward.
Yes.
Okay. Has the real estate community representing buyers and sellers begun to ask detailed questions about the association reserve site? Isn't it in our best interest to get this done? Listen, yes, from our perspective, for a variety of reasons, whether it be that this information is going to be very helpful moving into the legislative session for 2024, or whether it means that getting this information ahead so you're not, panicking at the 11th hour that we don't have it, we are encouraging our community associations to move forward with these requirements. Okay.
John,
What does pooling mean?
Pooling, it's just the way that your association funds their account. So the best example that I
Okay.
can give you is your checking account, Joan. I'm guessing you don't have one checking account for your grocery bill, one checking account for your electric bill, one checking account for your insurance bill. You have one account that has money in it, and then you pool from that one account to pay various bills. That is the difference between straight line versus pooling. Is the association basically has one reserve account for many different components. And when you have straight line funding, you have one account for each component. So you have one bucket of money for your roof, one bucket of money for your paving, and so on and so. It's just a way of that an association puts together their funding schedule. People have pros and cons to each method, but what we wanted to accomplish with this legislation is make sure that one of the tools in the association toolbox wasn't taken away. So whether you want to do it straight line or pool, that's up to you and your board.
And to answer Peter's question, that's incorrect. What we're saying is your structural integrity reserve study components can be pooled separate and apart from the other items that you may be reserving, which also can be pooled. So
Yeah, it's about not using from backing up and getting out of the weeds of all of this. What the legislature's concern is my building needs $4 million of concrete restoration work, or it might fall down. Association says, you know what? I'm not going to fix the concrete because the building might fall down. We're going to actually
redecorate the lobby.
redecorate the lobby and put carpet down. They wanted to avoid a scenario where an association picked an aesthetic over a safety reason. So that is why we're getting down into the weeds of all of this. I don't really agree. I think that's a red herring, but that's the idea is if you have an issue with your building that is a structural safety issue, that should take precedent over new carpet or new pool furniture. That's it. That's the layman's terms of what they're trying to accomplish.
Hey, Deb, there was a question on there about, is anything currently coming up within the legislation about insurance and the continuing increase in premiums? What's the appetite on that topic in Tallahassee?
Okay, Josh and Mark, wipe off your crystal ball.
The answer is I don't know. So there's lots of conversations going on right now with the Department of the Office of Insurance Regulation over at the CFO's office. The legislature is going to be hearing and continuing to hear more about that. We've had, I think, 3 special sessions on insurance since 2021. The stated public purpose of all these things they've said that they've done, the legislature, I mean, and the governor, was to attract the insurance market back to Florida so that we had providers providing insurance rather than citizens, which was always intended to be the insurer of last resort. So until those long-term effects could be accomplished, they all admit that in the interim, there's not going to be, it's going to be tough going for our homeowners. And so I don't know the answer to that. I know that that legislators, I think, are interested in maybe looking at some of this, whether or not it leads to something being filed. I don't have the answer to that, but we will have a short runway until next session, which begins in January of 24. So we'll start to see some of this probably begin to emerge sometime in the month of October or November, but it's too early to tell.
The one thing they did do in this bill, right, is they removed insurance from that 115% threshold, for that trigger on owners being able to petition for an alternate budget. They did do that.
Correct, because it's always going to go up by 115%. So you might as well remove insurance.
Let's try 200%.
Debbie, just to kind of opine too on what Mark said on insurance. I mean, there is no silver bullet that the legislature is going to do to fix the rising insurance market. I mean, it just does not exist, because you need to attract more carriers to the state to get rates to go down, right? If there's more competition of people writing insurance policies, especially for condos on the beaches, then they get more competitive rates. But the carriers just aren't going to be coming back into Florida overnight. It's going to take, as Mark said, we've had 3 special sessions on insurance in the last 2 years. And, we're not going to see any effects for 18 to 24 months. And we are having conversations with Office of Financial Regulation, CFO's office, OIR, to look at maybe some type of a stopgap. But, there just isn't anything that's going to be an overnight fix, unfortunately.
Well, and if you count the 3 special sessions we've had, and then you count the 3 regular sessions we've had, you've got 6 sessions of the legislature that have been devoted in whole or in part to the issue of insurance. And we still are seeing these problems play out. The one thing I know that the legislature has, I shouldn't say the legislature, but there have been some ideas that have been floated out there with the Office of Insurance Regulation, some of which I've been a part of, Josh has been a part of as well, has been could we set up a fund that would help offset the impact that associations are having, assuming you can get insurance, which is a whole other issue. If you can get it, how can you pay for it? The fiscal impact, the cost impact on our associations is so huge that you can't assess your way out of it, just like you, in many cases, cannot assess your way out of a lot of things. Insurance is one of those things you just can't assess your way out of. How do we do that? And so there was an idea that was being floated with the CFO's office of perhaps recommending to the legislature that maybe we set up a fund that would enable these associations to pay for, in the short term, the high cost of these premiums that, if you can get them, are just really cost prohibitive if you can ever get them. So there's a way to look. They're looking at possibly a fund at the federal level. There was some effort to try to do that, but that's really as much as I can give you at this point in time. But there could well be some other remedies that are addressed in the next several months.
For those of you that were around in 2005 and 6 when all of the carriers left. I guess it was after Andrew, everybody kind of left the state and we were really left with just Citizens. We actually came up with a program. For those of you who have been with us long enough to remember, it was called the Willis Program. Because I'm getting a lot of like, what other options do we have? Any self-insurance? Can we form captive insurance? We kind of came up with a whole different program, which actually saved our community associations money. And it was a unique way of purchasing the insurance. Unfortunately, it was met with much resistance by the agencies of the day. And so legislation had been passed to prohibit that type of program from being, for community associations even being able to take advantage of it. So right now, and self-insurance is not an option. It's very specific in the statute, how you have to insure, what options you have to do, and there isn't much leeway around what's existing in the statute today. Now, whether or not we take a look at that again, that may be an option, but it's ugly. I like the suggestion, a tax deduction for owners. That sounds good.
As a former insurance person, I'm Ann Ortley, I'm CASA 5 in Isla del Sol. We used to do high deductibles. There used to be a lot more options, and seeing the state is not supporting it, I think it's a little ridiculous that the individuals, organizations can't set this up themselves. So I get why they're doing it. They're protecting the agencies, but we've been going through a nightmare trying to figure out our insurance. And, I just think it's a ridiculous, short-sighted decision to ban it as an option. It seems a little coddling with the whole how much we have to have in reserve and all this, but that we're not allowed to self-insure or to explore other options and buy policies somewhere else. It just seems like, who are you pandering to? I find it very annoying. That's all.
I don't blame you.
Well, and also that's why the information that Debbie's requesting is so important, because we're going to need to go back to Tallahassee armed with data and numbers to show that there is actually a real problem. And then once we get them to acknowledge that there's a problem, they'll be a lot more open to ideas of finding alternative ways to pay for it.
I know, but we received from our insurance guy, like all these companies that it was supposedly submitted to that was out of market. And it's ridiculous. And even the state supported organization is now getting fussy about who it picks, the insurer of last resort. I mean, you have to do something. I mean, I know the governor is running for president, but he needs to get his little butt back to Florida and fix this, because the insurance and the reserves, coddling us and saying we have to do all this stuff because some building didn't maintain itself, but then not allowing us to be responsible homeowners, condo owners, and get affordable insurance. It's like the priorities are really upside down. So I appreciate all your work on this, totally, but I have to tell you, the level of frustration is enormous.
And we hear you.
So Debbie, I'm the one that's been asking the questions about the captive insurance. I'm very familiar with the construction industry, and a lot of large construction companies have offshore captives. Are you saying that the legislative laws in the state of Florida prevent, let's say we get 500 associations put together and they go to Bermuda and they get an insurance company to put together a program to insure all 500 of us, and we take all of our premium and put it in that offshore captive, buy a reinsurance policy? Are we allowed to do that?
I do not believe you are, because basically that's what we did, only not with an offshore program. It was with a legitimate program within Florida where we took all of our clients and we bought insurance, and we had reinsurance and all kinds of levels, and we insured every one of our properties under this program at a significant discount to them purchasing insurance. And this was back in 2007.
Well, then I would encourage your association to try and get that law changed, because we are getting raped
I know.
by insurance. We had to go borrow $150,000 last year just to pay our increased premium, and then they had to have a big assessment to our association because we couldn't pay our bill. Our
Yeah,
insurance.
right. And the offshore companies in Bermuda, that's where all the reinsurance companies, many of them are based in Europe. So that's the good tax haven for them. So it's
Okay.
not offshore, really. It's where the
Mhm.
reinsurance companies live, is
Right,
they live
okay.
in Bermuda.
So I'm not sure what we can do, but we hear you. And I will sidebar with Mark and Josh, let them know. I don't think they were familiar with what we did back in 2007. We'll kind of fill you in on that and see if there's any way that can be resurrected.
Okay, the one other thing that I wanted to raise, I had read this, that there was going to be legislation, I thought it was passed, that if you opt for arbitration rather than legislation, your premium would be reduced by 25%. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not. Josh or Mark?
No.
I have no idea.
Are you
where
talking
that-
about in your individual like policy?
I thought it applied to all property insurance throughout the state of Florida. The big problem was these roofing issues. There's a huge amount of litigation over roof issues, probably on mostly homes. But I thought it applied to any property insurance, regardless if it was an individual home or if it was a condo. But I'm not sure of that.
You're talking
I
about,
have heard, I have not seen any endorsement language. I have heard through several different insurance agents that there are companies out there that are offering that as an option and a way of reducing premium. But I have not seen the endorsement to have seen the language, but I have heard that from several insurance agents in the industry.
Well, this is a critical element because two of our associations here in where I live have just been told that they're not going to have insurance in November. We're not going to be insured by the same insurance company, and that the only one that's left is Citizens. Okay, and we're at their mercy, and it's going to go up again. And it's a very, very difficult situation for all of these associations, and in our opinion, worse than the structural issues.
Yeah, much worse than the structural, because that's a hurricane as opposed to, this is an ongoing issue. Captive insurance when I worked at AIG, which is a major insurance company, they pioneered captive insurance company for major corporations back in the 1970s. My boss pioneered it as part of the inland marine, and a lot of insurance companies purchased it because they would they would self-insure. And then only in the case of a catastrophic loss would it come in. So the deductibles are high, but the premium volume is very low. And there's no reason. It's been a model around in the industry for corporations. We have this group of people that are gathering here. Why can't we form a captive insurance company? And then see who else wants to show up. I mean, I think it's a ridiculous situation the way it's set up. And it needs to be changed. Yeah.
I totally agree with you, Ann. I think if we put all the associations together, the amount of premium that we could generate to form an offshore captive would be huge.
Yes, and there's market for it. And we can certainly hit up AIG or some of the reinsurance companies directly, to have them because they get the premium, they can do the reinsurance and just have it for catastrophic loss. Otherwise you self-insure.
Right.
With these new reserves that we have to keep anyway. So I'm like, this is a ridiculous rule and it needs to be addressed sooner rather than later, because these are huge assessments that are going out and the insurer of last resort is not insuring us. So this is completely unacceptable that all these insurance companies have left the state because the government doesn't help the citizens, doesn't help the insurance company. I'm in New York State. We're a very regulated insurance industry, and it's where AIG is housed. So it's ridiculous that this is going on like this. I get that we're the state where woke goes to die, but this isn't woke. This is money out of everybody's pockets.
Absolutely.
And a lot of money. It's ridiculous.
This is not about supply and demand.
No.
There's no supply. There's one
supply. Yeah.
Okay.
So let me just offer this.
That's called a monopoly. That's called a monopoly.
So perhaps one of the things that we may want to put together over the summer is maybe one of these seminars to kind of brainstorm some insurance ideas among our community associations. So thank you guys for your comments. I want to thank Mark and Josh for their input today and their willingness to share what information they could today about the Surfside bill and where we are. So thank you, Josh and Mark. Great job.
Good job, Josh and Mark. Thank you.
Yes. And anybody else have a last minute comment? Looks like we're good. Dot, we good? Josh, Mark?
We're good. Thank you so much, Debbie.
Thank
Appreciate
you,
all your-
guys.
all your
If we make our
comments.
own insurance company, we can make the deductible whatever it is. That's the regular. Somebody just wrote they won't let you
Yeah.
increase your deductibles. But if we have our own company,
Oh, yes.
we can make the
yes.
deductible whatever it is, Nancy.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you
guys.
taking the time out today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.